Hello, and welcome to today's web seminar, Performance Testing and Monitoring for Mobile Apps, How and Why, sponsored by Seagos and featuring Chris Carnegie, Director of Solutions at Seagos. I'm your host and moderator, Josiah Renauden. Thank you for joining us today. Before I hand it off to the speaker, let me explain the controls on this console. If you experience any technical issues, please send a note through the question field located beneath the panels, and we'll be on hand to help as quickly as possible. Our responses can be read in the Q&A panel to the left of the slides. It is also the same way to submit questions. We welcome all comments and inquiries during today's event, so feel free to ask as many as you'd like, and we'll answer as many as possible during the Q&A session after the presentation. Today's event contains polling questions, which can be answered within the slide view. To optimize your bandwidth for the best viewing experience possible, please close out any unnecessary applications that may be running in the background. At the bottom of your console is a widget toolbar. These widgets open panels. The console opens with three on your screen: the speaker, Q&A, and the slide panels. All of these panels can be moved around and resized to your liking. If you accidentally close one, click the respective widget to reopen the panel in its original place. Hover your cursor over these icons to reveal labels identifying each widget. Through these icons, you can download speaker slides, white papers, blog posts, and share this event with friends and colleagues. This event is being recorded and will be made available for on-demand viewing. Once the recording is ready, you'll receive an email with instructions on how to access the presentation and slides on demand. With that said, I'd like to introduce and pass the controls to our speaker, Chris.
Thank you, Josiah, and welcome everybody again to our webinar today, Performance Testing and Monitoring for Mobile Apps, How and Why. I'm Chris Carnegie, Director of Solutions at Seagos App Experience. We're going to spend some time talking today about why performance testing and monitoring for mobile apps is important, as well as how to do it. And we'll talk through some tips and tricks and things to think about as you build your entire practice of development, testing, and then ultimately monitoring that mobile application or site. So a little bit first about who is Seagos. We are the leader in automated end-to-end testing. We acquired Keynote Mobile Testing, formerly known as Device Anywhere, in 2016. This acquisition will accelerate product innovations in real device testing. Features powerful automation functionality that integrates seamlessly with agile development tools that will allow for both performance and functional testing. Again, today we're going to talk about that performance testing. And what is Seagos App Experience or Application Experience? It's a comprehensive suite of solutions for on-device app testing and app monitoring. We have a patented remote device interaction technology since 2003, again, formerly the Device Anywhere or Keynote Mobile Testing brand. We have solutions for single developers to global enterprises and integrations with leading CI platforms. About 1,000 devices available in both our public and private cloud and on-premise. We've got over 500 customers, including many Fortune 1000 companies. And as I walk through today's webinar, I'll share some experiences I've had in my 7 years here working with some of those smaller organizations or single developers all the way up to those global enterprises and how they've tackled the performance testing and monitoring of their application or site. During this webinar, I may refer to app or application, but I'm speaking of both a native or hybrid app sitting on a mobile device or your web app sitting on an MDOT or even a responsive website. So it's not limited just to applications that are installed on mobile devices. All right, so first, let's talk about some recent poor performing applications. Why is this so important to you, right? Who is this happening to? Well, there's some very public examples of very good companies. In this case, you see Southwest, Citibank, AMC Theaters, Best Buy in the past has had issues with this as well. Very good companies getting it wrong when it comes to the performance of their mobile application or site. As you see here on this slide, this leads the users or their consumers to leave negative feedback on the Google Play Store, the Apple App Store, which may keep future customers from using that application. And it really highlights how important it is to make sure that your app performance lives up to those customer expectations. And what are those expectations, and how can you make sure that your application or site aren't next and don't end up being talked about? So there's a cost to poor performance, right? Today's mobile consumers are more demanding and fickle than ever. Gone are the days when just having an app was enough now your apps must delight and amaze your customers or they just won't use them. They have to be high performing or you risk the consequences. A large enterprise, global organization that I work with, they've told me that their expectation internally of the performance of their mobile application is actually higher. So it must respond and perform better than a desktop version of that application or that site. Their tolerance internally is 3 seconds for that page inside their application to load on an iPhone, an iPad, an Android device. It's actually 5 seconds on a desktop browser. So they're really pushing that bar because their customers are demanding that. Their customers are demanding that their mobile experience is better and faster than the desktop experience. Most consumers are moving heavily towards mobile, whether it's for purchasing things, right, retail, whether it's managing your bank and your finances, whether it's managing your cell phone bill or whatever it may be. Everything's going mobile. So people are expecting the mobile experience to be better than that on their desktop or laptop computer. Recent study shows that only 16% of people are willing to give a slow application more than one try. I know if I download an application or I go to a mobile site and it's slow, I move on to something else and I may or may not ever go back. It's just that's what happens if your application is slow. When it comes to retail and abandonment, 65% is the average shopping cart abandonment rate. Of course, some of that is people put things in the cart, decide they don't actually want them. But a lot of it is caused by poor performance. It takes too long maybe to update your cart. It takes too long to check out. People are on the go, don't have time to wait, so they abandon that cart and, again, may or may not ever come back. So the stakes are very high. I mentioned everything's going mobile. Here, over $220 billion is the expected online mobile commerce sales in 2017. That's up 53% from last year. So poor performance will cost you. There is a direct correlation that can be made between bad performing sites or applications and the bottom line and your revenue. So think about how much money did those 3 companies we looked at earlier lose due to poor performance, whether it was Southwest, Citibank, Best Buy, Target. That all hit their bottom line. And that number, that cost, that risk is going to get greater and greater as people move more and more towards mobile. Again, this number is up 53% from last year. I don't know what to expect in 2018, but I guarantee that number is going to get substantially larger. All right, so a quick poll before we move on. Are you doing performance testing or monitoring at your organization? And just a simple yes or no. But I always like to ask this when I talk to new organizations, to new companies that I speak to, new organizations, to find out where they are in the maturity of their thinking, of their testing practice, right? Functional testing is one thing. Does it work? Can a user get from A to B to C? But how much thought is being put into making sure that the customer's experience is what they expect or what you expect to be providing to them? All right, we'll give it a couple more seconds here. All right, so let's take a look at these numbers now. So you see 75% of you, so just about 75 out of 100 that took the poll are doing performance testing or monitoring, and I think that's great. I think that everybody needs to be doing something. Those of you that said no, maybe it's not in your job focus, maybe it's not in your purview, but hopefully someone, some group in your organization is either doing or thinking about performance testing or monitoring to make sure that, again, not only does your application or site behave the way that it's supposed to your customer, but that experience that the customer's having is up to their and your standards. So whether it's your own internal SLAs or your third-party SLAs that you put on your vendors or maybe content providers, but also, again, what that customer expects. I many times talk to companies and they say, hey, I don't have to worry about it. People will put a rating up in the Apple App Store, the Google Play Store. I'll find out if it's not working properly. that way, or, well, we don't get complaints directly. I think that's a bad way to look at it. I think that testing for performance and then ultimately monitoring for the performance once it goes to production should be part of your testing practice. Your testing practice should not just be limited to functional testing and UI testing. It really should be about performance as well. So we're going to talk about why that's important. We're going to talk about what can be done and how you can do it as well here in this webinar. All right, so far we're being pretty theoretical. So let's be specific and define what we mean by performance. Sometimes when people talk about performance testing, they're thinking specifically about load testing. You could be thinking about API responsiveness, or when you interact with the applications. You could be talking about the actual performance of the hardware, right? The mobile device, the CPU, the memory, that sort of thing. I'd like to broaden the concept a bit and talk about it both holistically and also from the point of view of the customer using your app. So what is performance? Performance is the customer's perception of how long they had to wait. Now, why do I say this? I think there's two important concepts here. The first is that it's about customer perception. Perception's everything. Not actual performance, although obviously that will be related, but it's about their perception. That's important because customer perception is not perfect or even. A customer cannot easily, for instance, tell the difference between something that takes 1.2 seconds and something that takes 1.3 seconds. A customer may believe that certain transactions should take longer and others should take less time, and that colors their view of performance. Right? If I'm using a banking application, I think that my account balance should come up really quick. But if I'm doing a balance transfer, I'm sending money to somebody, I expect that to take longer. So that's okay. So that's why I say it's really about customer perception, not the actual performance numbers. The second is that it's a very negative way to look at performance, right? Sometimes people experience great performance, and sometimes they still think that it's slow. Everyone has their own thresholds. So why am I talking about the negative here, though? And I'll get back to this later. All right, so let's look at some study data. This was collected from a study that we ran that looked at the process of applying for auto insurance online. We used about 1,000 panelists who were asked about performance. They were real people, and over 100,000 measurements of performance. Now, those over 100,000 measurements were done from web, so it was a browser, it was not a mobile app. But in general, this gives you a good idea of the user's reactions and perceptions of performance, and that they're similar regardless of the media that they're using, whether it's mobile or desktop. This graph plots the relationship to how people rate a site's performance and objectively how slow it is. Almost all of the sites show a tight correlation. Those that are faster than average are perceived faster than average, and those that are slower are perceived as slower. So people do notice when your site is slow. So it's important to work off the real numbers that you get when you're doing this performance testing. If your numbers are slow, people are going to notice it's slow. If your numbers are fast, they're likely to notice that it's fast. But it's still important to remember, this is all about customers' perception. And there's some things we can do to tweak their perception to make it different than the real numbers. Maybe something like having the visible page fully loaded and rendered, even though there's other things loading in the background. Right? So it's about organizing the content of the page to load fast enough so the user thinks that everything's done, but maybe there's still something going on in the background that they don't see. But the perception is that the page is ready to go, that the application is ready to use. So there's some tricks that we can use to do this. Because at the end of the day, it's all about perception, and your users, your customers' only view into your site or your application is that mobile device, whether it's a phone or a tablet. Okay, so does performance matter? We say, yeah, people notice when your site is slow. Does that matter? Well, not necessarily. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Performance only matters when it affects your business outcome. You may have some areas of your application that are seldom visited. Maybe it's a frequently asked questions. Maybe it's a help page, right? Things that aren't visited or used that often. So they might not be important to a critical user journey, like purchasing something, like doing a balance transfer. So that performance might not matter. There are actually some parts of those user journeys or transactions where a customer expects poor performance or slower performance. Like I said, submitting a payment. So it's the business outcomes that matter. And if performance affects your business outcomes, then performance, of course, matters. We also know that once objective performance is fast enough, customers shift their focus to the UI, or the number of steps taken to find what they want. So our goal should be to make site performance and quality transparent to our customers. So it has to be fast enough, and there is a balance. How fast is fast enough? Right? Is Google your goal? Probably not. And there is a point when fast is fast enough. Right? You're going to start hitting the point of diminished returns. So you want the perception of your customers to say, yes, this is quick enough. You want to make sure that you then focus on the things you can control. Right? You might not only be able to get that sign-in or that balance transfer page to load in 3 seconds. You're not going to be able to get any faster. But what you can do is make sure that the method they use to get to that page or to that piece, that functionality, is faster. Maybe instead of 5 steps, it's 4 now. You can consolidate, and that user perception will think that it's faster, even though the loading time is truly still the same. All right, so now let's get back to that statement of what performance is and how it's the customer perception of how long they have to wait and kind of the negative nature of that statement. And now, why do I say specifically it's a negative impactor? It may be a little bit confusing, but I say this because good performance does not necessarily translate to improved conversion or sales, right? Negative or performance really only can negatively affect conversion rates or sales or adoption or satisfaction. So let's look at some data on this too. This study correlated performance to user behavior. For this example, it was completing a self-service task or purchasing a product. What we found is that bad performance impacts the likelihood of conversion. And you can see that here. We see that if the number of page views, the percentage of page views with an interaction of greater than 5 seconds, as it got slower and slower, the probability of self-service start went down further and further. And we can see that over here on the right as well. So imagine 6 customers who all traverse 10 screens. So we see that the conversion rates drop dramatically as users experience slower and slower load times. But good performance, or really good performance, doesn't positively impact conversion. So it's kind of disappointing, but it makes sense. You can have an amazing performance in your app or on your site, but that's not going to make someone buy something they didn't already want to buy. Right? Bad performance can discourage them from completing something that they intended to do. If I go to Amazon and I'm going to buy something, I want it to be quick. If it's quick, then I'm going to buy it. But just because their site's fast doesn't mean that I'm going to go buy something that I don't need. So performance really only has a negative impact. So when your performance is poor, satisfaction, conversion, sales, adoption are poor as well. So that means that our goal should be to make performance and quality, again, transparent to the customers. It has to be fast enough, and you've got to find that balance. So how fast is fast enough? All right, so again, some more about when performance matters. We said performance negatively impacts conversion. So we see here the top 4 or 5, what have people done when they experienced a mobile app that regularly ran slow? Well, they uninstalled or removed it. They stopped using it. They looked for an alternative app. They used it less often. They gave it a negative star rating. So anytime the performance of your app negatively affects your business outcomes, that's when it matters. We saw on the last slide, performance matters when it negatively impacts conversions, Other metrics that can negatively impact that you might be concerned about: number of downloads, adoption rates, right? It's one thing to download an application, but if you don't adopt it, if your customers don't use it, that download was a waste. Of course, your ratings. If there's other applications they can choose from and your rating is lower than the others, you're less likely to be downloaded and ultimately adopted. We've all been victim to a slow-performing app or site. Again, I know I quickly move on to the next app or site when this happens. And studies and anecdotes show that I'm not alone. So the biggest thing to remember here about when performance matters is if it impacts business outcomes, it absolutely matters. All right, performance testing for mobile versus web. It is not equal. It is absolutely different. Performance testing for web. You can do a lot of performance testing for web, but it's not going to give you the same insight into the customer's experience on mobile. There's all different sorts of characteristics about the application, about the device or browser that it's sitting on. There's just so much more variance that you've got with mobile than you do with web. With web, you traditionally have, I'll say, 3 browsers: Chrome, Safari, IE, maybe Firefox. And they use certain standards that they are written to adhere to as far as rendering, as far as completion events, those sorts of things. On mobile, that's much different. So again, why? There's all that variance. What factors can affect mobile performance testing and make it harder than web-based performance testing? It's all those variations. I'll tell you, I've talked to a lot of people that do performance testing and monitoring for desktop sites, and they absolutely will tell you that mobile is much more difficult. And these are the reasons they'll tell you. There's application structure. Is it a native application, a hybrid application, or a browser? Different devices. There's cell phones, there's tablets, there's phablets, there's other connected devices. There's the new IoT craze coming. There's wearables. There's different platforms: Android, iOS, BlackBerry, Windows, and then again also all of the other connected device platforms. There's different OS versions, right? So there's the latest iOS and Android, but there's also old ones. Not everybody updates the day that a new version comes out. In fact, iOS users tend to update very quickly. Android, I believe the most popular Android version right now is still either 4.4 or 5.0, even though 7.0 was just released. So there's a lot of different variations. There's different CPUs, there's different screen size and memory, different networks: 4G, 3G, LTE, Wi-Fi. You have latency and bandwidth. You have drops. You've got all sorts of different things to worry about versus desktop web. You've got geography and location. So there may be location-based issues. Geofencing, there may be certain content that is not available in certain regions. A lot of streaming TV providers, you must be in one of their service areas or in their country at least to do this sort of testing on a mobile device. On desktop, it's a lot easier because you don't have that restriction. And of course, other real-life conditions: incoming calls, battery life, memory shortage, switching on or off Wi-Fi, cellular, background applications, SMS notifications, push notifications. There's all sorts of things that can happen while you're using a mobile device that don't rear their ugly heads with your desktop web as well. So there's a number of things to consider when testing mobile performance that don't affect web performance. So there's also the system components for mobile performance testing. So there's client application performance, so it's the browser, right? It primarily uses server-side application and the network versus native. Primarily uses your local resources on the device. You've got device configuration, hardware, the software, the model, processor, memory, location even, right? Samsung Galaxy S7 has different models with different CPUs, different memory in different regions around the globe. One device is not the same everywhere in the world, but a browser in the US is the same as a browser in the UK. It's the same as a browser in Australia. So mobile has so many different variations. You may also have a different database, application server, different hardware for your mobile. It may not be using the same hardware on the back end. Then, of course, the network. There's different networks, different countries. That network latency can depend on data transmission algorithms that are put up by the carriers, as well as the actual data amount, the payload that's being sent. It may be routed through different switches, through different towers, depending on what that content is, where it is. You could also have your own load balancing internally. So a device, connecting from California may run through a different route than one from New York or from overseas. All right, another quick poll. So those of you who are testing performance, what tool or tools are you using today? And I give you two options, or really three, HP tools or IBM tools. And if you're using something else, please type it into the Q&A window. We'd like to see what sort of tools other people are using. HP, of course, you've got all sorts of tools. You've got, HP Performance Center being probably the most popular for those doing performance. And then IBM has its whole rational suite of tools as well to do this. What we generally see is for performance testing, we see people using a lot of HP tools. For desktop, most people aren't using anything right now for performance other than devices in their hand. For mobile performance, except for devices in their hand and literally a stopwatch and keeping track of things like that. There's a lot of good answers coming in through the chat. I'll mention a couple of them. Out of here, I won't mention anybody by name that put them in here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll here. All right, so not surprising, about 45% using HP, very small percentage using IBM, and about half of you using other tools. I'm seeing things like Neoload, JMeter. I'm seeing Keynote, which I, of course, like to hear, coming from Keynote originally, or Dynatrace. So a lot of those tools are, of course, desktop friendly. They may or may not have a good solution for mobile. So we'll talk about how you can do that same sort of testing for performance, but again, move it over to mobile now. But it's good to see that a lot of you are using something, right? It may be traditionally for desktop, but you are at least thinking about it. All right, so hopefully at this point, everyone's convinced that performance is important and why it's important. Now let's talk about what do we do about it. So we'll go through here a number of best practices that will ensure your application won't get deleted. Right? So people will adopt it. People will use it. It will help improve your desired business outcomes. So first, to ensure that you think about performance from the beginning of the development process. It's not an afterthought. You need to design for performance. Second, make sure that when you test for performance, you do so from the customer's point of view. Right? It's all about, again, that customer's perception. Third is that performance can, of course, change due to load, so that's another dimension of testing that's important to do. And lastly, to not just test performance, but build a practice around it so that you can track it over time. Don't just test right before the release and say, yep, that's fast enough, and then forget about it. And then the next time, right before release, test again. You need to make it part of the overall practice so that you can track it over time and make sure that things are improving, or if nothing else, that they're not getting worse. All right, so a couple different ways performance targets can get set. So again, we want to design for performance here. So most simply, the 3-second rule, right? On one of those first slides I showed you, 3 seconds seems to be about and it's anecdotally, but seems to be about the tolerance people have for a site or application page to load on their mobile device. So quick way to do it, say, yep, got to be 3 seconds. Second way is to do benchmarking. So you can look at other companies. You can look at competitors. how quickly are their applications working? How quickly are their pages on their site loading? It doesn't have to be competitors. You can also pick a site or application that you think you have a very good experience with, and that can be used as kind of aspirational goals. I want to be as fast or faster than XYZ company. It doesn't have to be a direct competitor. And lastly, you can correlate to actual data. So you can look and see, okay, well, I know today my customers are happy with the performance of my application or site. What sort of data am I getting right now? How fast is it performing? Is it 2-second load time, 3-second load time, whatever it is? And let's make sure that we design to be better than that, or again, at least as good as that today. So it's important to make performance testing a part of the design and development process because, as you see here and all know, the cost of fixing poor performance increases the closer you get to production release. Find your performance issues earlier in order to save time and money. You'll see it's about a third or a quarter of the cost to find that performance issue during design. It's about half during testing. If you find it in production, it's very, very costly. All right, so what if there aren't any specified targets? You as testing professionals should ask for and even demand them. I have been working with my product team for a while, and anytime my testing department tells them that there's something they didn't specify, as far as a performance target, that they think should have been specified, my product team does it. You should be asking and demanding for these targets. No one wants a slow application, so ask for those targets. Again, they can be based on business objectives, different KPIs, different test objectives. And then ask for parameters that will help you measure your test objectives, whether they're a general time for every screen, maybe tied to specific transactions, maybe both, right? So how long should, or how quickly should our pages load? Okay, they might say 3 seconds. You say, okay, well, I know that balance transfer may take longer than that. What is a realistic load time for that action, that part of the user journey? Because customers may be more tolerant, again, of some certain pieces of that user journey than others. Something else to keep in mind, a lot of this application development is outsourced. That makes it even more important to specify performance requirements at the start of development. Make it a feature of the app being developed. And you as testers can ensure that that feature requirement is met. You don't want to be delivered an app from an outsourced team, from a vendor, and try and go back later and say, well, it's not fast enough. They're going to say, well, that wasn't part of the requirements. So make sure that those performance targets are part of the design requirements for either your internal development team, design team, or that outsourced team. All right, so to give you an idea of what benchmarking looks like and also some best practice data, this data is from a study in the travel and hospitality industry. We looked at 10 prominent companies across a number of different functions, including launching your app or launching the app, searching, viewing product detail screen, going through a booking process. This particular company who the study was delivered to wanted to understand their performance versus their key competitors in the space. These numbers represent, in many cases, multiple steps. They show the average across all of the screens. So if you have a multiple step transaction, it will average all steps. So here you can see the best in class coming in all cases at less than 2 seconds and sometimes less than 1. Average performance is about 3 to 4 seconds, except in the case of search, which makes sense. So that kind of bears up the 3-second rule for decent performance. You won't be leading the pack at 3 seconds, but you won't be embarrassing yourself. You won't be losing adopters. You won't be losing users or getting negative reviews. Again, this is just one study, though, to show you that it is right about 3 seconds. Seems to be a good number to start with if you aren't given any requirements by your product or design team. All right, there's multiple ways to gather performance information. The most costly, I think, is physically testing on a device in your hand. It's rather slow. It's prone to error and fatigue by testers. It's costly. got limited hours of testing, right? But that's what a lot of people that we talk to today are doing. They've got real phones in their testers' hands, and they're using stopwatches. They type in a username and password, they press sign in, they start a stopwatch, and as soon as they see that the page is loaded that says maybe welcome user, they stop the stopwatch. All right. Very prone to error, very costly, very fatigue prone, just doing the same thing over and over and over again. And of course, you're limited to the hours that your testers are in the office. Another way to gather this performance information is using a device cloud or other service like Seagos to manually test on a variety of devices. So you can increase that coverage to multiple OS versions, multiple models, and different handsets. You can automate tests that you can run on real devices. Seagos has this capability as well. You can also utilize in-app stats if they collect performance information. So you may have your application already tagged or instrumented to gather this sort of data. You can use that as well. The one common piece here, though, that I can't stress enough is ensuring that you're testing the real customer experience. This means testing end-to-end from a real device. It doesn't really matter if your APIs work great. Something causes the screen to render slow. I'm not saying that API testing is not important, but that's not the focus here. It can help you diagnose issues. The focus here is to understand the experience the customer is going to have. Your customer's only view into your app or site is through a real device, so you need to understand their experience and their perception of the performance of your application on a real device. Okay, some other items to be aware of. Don't just test from one handset or one real device. At the very least, understand performance across the operating systems that you support. As you see here, performance can vary widely across iOS and Android. Even when you're doing something simple like looking up search results, where the network connection seems like the most important component to speed, you'll still see wide performance variation, although these test devices that we did this on were actually in the same location. So same network, same bandwidth, and you still see differences, quite dramatic in some cases, on differences between iOS and Android for the same step. Another thing this highlights is, and I've seen this personally with a lot of our customers, is sometimes the apps are outsourced. Sometimes the Android app is outsourced and the iOS one is not, or vice versa. Or they're developed by different companies. It's even more reason to test performance across both platforms. Because the iOS developers may have done a great job optimizing things for performance, but the Android team didn't, or vice versa. So you need to understand how your customers are experiencing your application from as many different data points as you can. In this case, those data points are different real devices. All right, so far we've shown a lot of performance metrics, all of them averages. But of course, performance varies, and it does for a lot of reasons: bad internet connection, inefficient back-end calls, slow phone processors. Also, the number of customers using your app can make a difference. The last thing you want is to fall down at the moment of your greatest success. So basically, when you have the greatest number of customers using your system, that's when it's going to get slow. You don't want it to affect that conversion. You don't want to increase abandonment, maybe even a retail cart. So before you go live with your app, along with setting up performance targets from the beginning and testing on real devices to ensure you're meeting them, you should test your system under stress. So I'm saying here, test from a real device again. But it doesn't make sense to have hundreds or thousands or even millions of devices to load your app up. So drive traffic using a cloud-based service, which utilizes the cloud and can load up your back-end servers. Then collect performance metrics on real devices. But you only need a small number. And then you can understand how the end user will be impacted when the system is loaded. I've done exactly this with a few of my customers, and we may start with zero load on the system. We run a performance test with maybe 10 different devices, 5 iOS and 5 Android, and we see the average load time is 2 seconds for a specific page. We start generating load from the cloud onto those back-end systems to maybe 500 concurrent users. We run that same test on the real 10 devices, and we see, okay, it hasn't increased at all, still 2 seconds. Then we say, okay, let's ramp that load generated from the cloud up to 1,000 concurrent sessions or 5,000 or 10,000, whatever numbers you'd like to test on. And we continue to then run the performance test on real devices, so same 10. And we can see that now under 5,000 concurrent sessions, we see that the average load time is 2.2 seconds. Under 10,000, it's now 3 seconds. So we can see when do we reach the breaking point. Not the breaking point of when does our site break, when does it fail and stop responding, but when do we pass over the acceptable performance, right? If our performance target is 3 seconds, that's great. It was running at 2, but at 10,000 users, it now takes 3.5 seconds, and that's not okay. So we can then talk to our either design team for the application, we can talk to our network or our back-end services team to decide, how do we fix this? Where do we want to invest our resources? Are there things we can do to the app, or are there things we do to the back-end systems to accommodate for that greater load? But we do need to understand how that load impacts performance. Again, from real devices, because the performance is all about that user perception. All right, so building a performance practice doesn't sound so hard, right? But for many organizations, it's incredibly difficult. And the reason we see for this is silos. Most of our customers are not single-team startups who are developing a simple app from scratch. Instead, they're massively complex organizations and applications that may have multiple functions and audiences, or the need to work across legacy back-end systems. And they face massive silos. These include different teams internally, outside agencies and firms, true third parties. There can be silos between business and technology, and between QA and operations and development, production. There can be silos between the mobile and desktop teams, between parts of the site that are insourced and parts that are outsourced. I've seen actually a financial institution that had a team that focused only on the pre-login pieces of their desktop and mobile application. So anything you could do without being logged in was the purview and responsibility of Team A. It's a completely different group within the organization that handled anything that was after you log in. Account balance, balance transfer. And in fact, those teams were very siloed. They didn't communicate. They weren't allowed to. That can make it very difficult to build this sort of performance practice. All of these things create dysfunctions and barriers to performance optimization. It's not a technology problem, but an organizational or cultural and process problem. So it's important to be able to speak the same language and have the same goals. We talked about that earlier when I said it was important to have performance be a requirement. But beyond that, it has to be measured consistently across teams, so everyone has a common goal and can work together effectively towards that goal. So we need to agree on a small set of critical metrics to start. Don't drown yourself in data. You pick key transactions across one iOS, one Android device. You want to measure before and after a release. It's even better if you can use the same technology to measure both pre- and post-production. Seagos supports this capability. And remember to measure from the customer's point of view. So from real devices, on real carriers, in real locations. You want to make sure these measurements are published to all teams. When there are performance issues, make sure that things are coordinated, ops, and QA, and development, to see what the cause is and to build testing into the next release cycle so it doesn't happen again. So for example, I'm working with a large financial institution. It's a mix of business, technology teams, mobile teams, desktop teams, ops, outsourced teams. The approach was first, get the data, set the common language. Let's move not siloed measurements, but to a view of customer performance in the browser. No customer cares that your part of the site is fast, right? Nobody cares that, hey, pre-login's fast, but post-login, so they don't care who's responsible. They care that everything works, and that it works to their perceived good performance numbers, right? That's that perception. And we start reporting out consistent metrics. We remove the ownership from any one silo and be objective. Because again, the customer doesn't care what team owns that poor performing part. Then provide recommendations based on that customer impact. Right? How is this poor performance impacting your customers? Not how it's impacted, not on the silo or the technology stack that it's on, but based on, again, how it impacts the customer, regardless of what silo it falls in. So the result is that we're starting to see the teams who before played a pass-the-buck game starting to come together, starting to get the business to understand the impact of their decisions, starting to see performance become something that's moving back in the life cycle from production into the development standards and QA certification. They're becoming requirements during design so that it doesn't fall under any one single silo. It falls under the business as a whole. Again, I'm talking about a process that's not wholly owned by testing, but testing can really play a leading role here. You are the arbiters of quality, and driving to put process into place that ensures quality from the customer's point of view will both up the level of contribution from the testing team and, of course, ensure a successful product, successful customers, and successful desired business outcomes. So to recap, we want to build a practice around mobile application performance testing and monitoring. We want to design for performance. So come up with those requirements for testing, right? What are those performance targets that you're going to test for? How are you going to test for them? How are you going to measure? How are you going to track how well your new design, your new releases are tracking towards those targets? You need to validate the performance from the customer's point of view. Remember we said it's all about perception. It's what does the customer perceive that to be. We want to understand the load impact on performance. Again, generate that load from the cloud, but still do the testing on real devices. And then build a performance practice. I shared an example of a financial institution that we recently worked with. They are well on their way to having a very good practice around performance and really understanding how their decisions affect that customer's view of their application and how it affects their experience. Now, Seagos Application Experience can help you with every one of these. We have the ability, we can provide access to real devices in multiple locations to both manually test and measure performance, as well as do so in an automated fashion as well. It will allow you to do this testing and monitoring from a variety of locations, a variety of handsets with different platforms, iOS, Android, of course the leading two, with a variety of operating system versions, because as we mentioned, you can't just test on the latest version of iOS because that's not the only version your customers are using. So what we want to do is turn your annoyed customer into a happy customer. All right, so Seagos Application Experience can help. You'll see here on the right, this is actually a real device with a performance test that was created. It walks through exactly what a real user would do. It is stepping through a buy flow on the AT&T website to buy an iPhone. And it's timing how long those different pieces take. How long does it take from the time a user selects a phone until it comes up in their cart, and so on. So it's a true user experience view from a real device. And you get breakdown of performance by key transactions or user interactions like logging in, buying, selling, if you're talking about trades, if you're talking about something like eBay, sending money, booking a room, all sorts of things. And so we get performance charts, as you see here on the bottom left, that will show you that, well, out of these three steps here, I am actually most worried about this orange one on the top. So that might be my login. I can focus my time, my testing efforts, my design efforts on the login step. Why is it taking so long? How can I make that faster? All right, so just a quick aside here. We can try Seagos App Experience for free, either a 7-day trial of Seagos App Testing, or we can schedule a demo of Seagos App Monitoring. Excuse me. Again, I just want to re-mention that Keynote Mobile by Dynatrace was acquired by Seagos. So any reference you see to Dynatrace or Keynote Mobile, either here on the slide deck or on a download that we'll provide at the end of this webinar is actually now Seagos application experience. There's also a new email address you see here, mobiletesting@seagos.com. You may have been familiar with previous ones that may have said keynote.com. There's a new email address as well. Again, Seagos acquired Keynote Mobile Testing by Dynatrace, so any legacy branding you see, please now know that that does actually refer to Seagos. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Josiah to moderate some Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Chris. Before we start Q&A, remember you can ask Chris questions by typing them in the field beneath the panel, then by clicking the Submit button. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible, but for those questions we're unable to answer during the live Q&A, some will be answered offline. All right, let's start right over here with this one. This person asked, I think something you touched on a little bit, but he's looking for a little bit more clarification. How is performance testing for mobile different from traditional performance testing?
Sure, that's a great question, and you're right. We covered it a little bit, but the ultimate goal is actually the same, right? We want to make sure that the performance of our application or our site, whether it's desktop or mobile, meets our requirements. And again, those requirements might be set internally, they might be set by your users, but it's all about making sure that things perform as you want them to, and based on that customer experience and perception. The differences, though, the difficulties for mobile come from all the different variations. I mentioned earlier there's really only a few browsers, desktop browsers, right? So that helps limit things. When it turns to mobile, we have different platforms, so Android, iOS. We have different operating system versions, different CPUs, different amount of memory. Things are much more affected on a mobile by the actual mobile device itself. Even if you're doing a browser, you're talking about a mobile site on a mobile browser. So the ultimate goal of performance testing for web and desktop, mobile and desktop are the same, but the variations and the things you need to account for mobile make it much, much more difficult.
All right, thank you so much. We have another good broad one here. This person asks, should I do this type of testing and monitoring from more than one location?
That's a great question. We generally recommend that you do this sort of testing and monitoring from the locations that you see your users using your application from. So I deal with a nationwide, so U.S. Investment firm, and they have users all over the country, but the biggest populations of users are in California and in New York. So we are actually helping them test and monitor the performance of their applications from both San Francisco and New York because they want to make sure that the performance in both locations is good. It doesn't really mean anything to a New York user that San Francisco is running nice and it's running faster in San Francisco or vice versa. And they also know that they have different backends that come into their data centers, right? They may co-locate their hosting in different locations and different load balancers that say, okay, well, if a user from New York tries to log in, it's going to go through load balancer A. And San Francisco is going to go through load balancer B. So they want to test from multiple locations, and we always recommend that is done, especially if you have kind of dense populations of users in different locations. And it may be in multiple locations around the globe, depending on your user population.
All right, next question right over here. This one asks, should I be concerned with testing on multiple OS versions?
Yeah, so that's another good one. I say yes. We see most people doing this sort of testing on the most recent version of the operating system, so let's say iOS 10, as well as the latest -1, so iOS 9 as well. And the reason for that is there can be some very drastic changes in how things run in those major releases. So iOS 10, if you're talking a mobile browser, right, a mobile site, a new version of Safari, a new version of WebKit may run and render things differently than in iOS 9. Same goes for Android. And there's some underlying changes that your customers may not be aware of. So they're just going to think, well, this application, this site got slower when I updated to this version of the operating system or when I stayed compared to my friends on the newer version. So it's important to make sure that you're still testing on some of the older versions as well, because at the end of the day, the customers are going to blame you. They're not going to blame the phone. They're not going to blame the network. They're going to say this application or this site is slow.
All right, thank you so much. Let's go back to the top of the list over here. This person asks, how often should I run these tests?
It's a really good question. So I recommend that these tests are run at least before every release candidate or before a build is marked as a release candidate, because you don't want to have this performance be the thing that keeps you from releasing, right? You want to have your testing team say yay or nay to the meeting performance targets before that becomes the gating factor to release. And in fact, I would say even run maybe a small subset of these performance tests with every build, because anytime your developers change anything, they could be actually affecting performance without knowing it. So I would say maybe, depending on the frequency of your builds, if you do nightly builds, you might not want to run it every night, but maybe run it once a week. If you do weekly builds, run it once a week and see how have any of those changes affected the performance. Now, when we're talking production, what I would call monitoring, right? It's not a test anymore because the application's been released. It's important to understand how your users are experiencing your application once it's released as well. And those tests, or those monitors as we call them, I have customers running those as frequently as every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day, because they don't want to go any amount of time without knowing if something's going down, something's wrong, if the users can no longer sign in, if the user login can now take 10 seconds instead of taking 2 as expected. So it really depends on the part of your development process that you're starting to bring this into.
All right, this question is a little bit more specific, Chris. Hopefully I'm not catching you too off guard. But
Sure.
The person asks, what are some strategies you've employed to reliably collect results on performance testing when generating load from the cloud, where there are so many variances such as CPU, memory, and latency?
Sure. So it can be difficult. What we see people do is generate that load from the cloud, whether it's through Load Runner, through Dynatrace, through other mechanisms, and then use the Seaghost devices, the real devices, as kind of your benchmark. So you say, okay, under no load, an iPhone 7 with X amount of memory, either no apps running on it or 5 apps running on it, plus the app under test. Here's how long it takes, and do the same thing for Android. And then as you slowly ramp up the load from the cloud, again, so these kind of virtual users, to use one of the tool's terms, then you continue to run that same test. Now you're right, there are a lot of variables, but to get you a good benchmark, that is the way that we see people being successful doing it. Say, okay, across these 4 different devices, maybe a new iOS, new Android, an older iOS, an older Android, this is the type of performance we see under load. It's of course going to miss some variations, but the goal here isn't to cover every variation under load. It's to understand how load in general is going to affect that performance, because you can bet with pretty much certain that if it slows down on one device, it's going to slow down on another device, even though it may not be the exact number. Right? On an iPhone 7, it might slow down from 5 to 10. On an iPhone 6, it might go from 6 to 12. But you know it's going to slow down, because if it can't serve the content fast enough to any device, it's going to slow down on all devices.
All right, thanks so much. And we have a bunch of good questions here, but we have time for just about one more. So this person wants to know, what's a good way for his or her company to find out a competitor's load times without manually loading their applications?
Yeah, that's a good one. I get asked that a lot. Generally, it either comes down to obviously not having the time to do it, or sometimes not being allowed to test or use competitor applications. So Seaghost actually provides a service to do this for you. We can run a benchmark for you to tell you, okay, well, let's say you are you're Bank A, and you want to know how Bank B, C, and D, how their applications perform. So you can say, okay, are we faster? Do we need to get faster? And we have a professional services team that can actually run a study for you or a benchmark for you to tell you that, hey, Here's how the other applications are performing. Here's how your application performs. And then we can even work with you in a consulting role to walk through how you can make yours faster, or how you can improve yours, or what you're doing better than them and what they're doing better than you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
So that ends our event for today. I'd like to thank our speaker, Chris, for his time. I'd like to thank Seagos for sponsoring this event. Also, a special thank you goes out to you, the audience, for spending the last hour with us. Have a great day, and we hope to see you at a future event.